you absolutely can't go through and analyze a month's worth of training without a cup of coffee first. So we're going to jump in. Thanks again for all the support on this channel so far, particularly from you guys, channel members. Really do appreciate you hitting that join button. It does help out a lot. And also, I want to give back to you guys by making these videos and give you some extra value by contributing to the channel, helping it grow, and being those really great active supporters you are. So in this one, we're going to jump through, look at the first month worth of training, October 2021, what happened. Obviously, as you know, if you've been following on the vlog series, this was our initial introduction to training. So there is some really basic stuff in there. And what I did last week is I put up on the community page just for members to respond to, what are the things you want to see? And we got some really great responses. And I'm going to go through as much as I can. If there are some things left out, strategically left out, because I want to keep that maybe for next month, it will make a bit more sense once I get into once I am now currently in a bit more of a routine structure, greater training volume in terms of the running. There's more you can see in terms of heart rate in those sessions as well. There's some good things that we can look at in this first month, but particularly for things like strength and that, I'll go into the nuts and bolts probably in the next installment of this one for you guys, the November monthly analysis, looking at sets and rep schemes and the why behind that. But we're going to look mainly at just this introduction phase and a couple of the key principles that I was following along, a little bit more detail than what you would have seen in those vlogs. Let me know as well in the comments, before we jump across the training peaks, how do you want this format to be? Do you want it to be me talking through training peaks? Do you want it to be a live stream that we do once a month? I know it's difficult because we've got a bunch of you who are in different time zones to where I am and each other. So I don't know, what would you prefer? Would you like it live? Would you like it as a Q&A? Would you like a Q&A as well as this recorded video so you can watch it, break it all down, and then ask further questions on the back of that? I really want to make the membership really as valuable to you guys as possible. And let me know as well what other things you want to see. I did put up a post recently asking what are the types of things in the membership you want to see. Let me know. Always happy to hear some ideas. I've got some ideas of my own that I want to expand and grow on as this little community grows. But again, appreciate your support so far. So let's jump across the training peaks. Let's get stuck into the coffee and we'll go through the first month of training, really analyze it in depth like I would with an athlete or client that I'm working with. All right, so now we're over here on training peaks and let's have a look at that first month that we went through. As I mentioned, it was an introduction, reintroducing training as a structured format rather than just going out and doing sort of anything and just keeping generally fit. Now it's a case of let's get some structure to the week. Let's get a little bit of continuity. I know some of these sessions these sessions don't flow necessarily as smoothly as a common training program. This next block I'm about to jump in November will do that. But the point of this and the goal was really to get some good compliance. And what I mean by that is just get into the sessions and get them done. Basically be able to wake up and go, yes, I'm going to get the sessions done today, which was a bit of a struggle initially. And you'll be able to see that here. And even if we just scroll through training peaks in this first month, like a lot of green. What that immediately tells me, and this is one of the key things I like about using training peaks, is that very quickly I can see, compared to the planned duration or the planned amount of time, the amount of distance that I've put in there, any particular metrics I've put in as a planned part of the session in training peaks, how did my actual session and my data that I've uploaded as a result, how did that relate to that? So green means really highly compliant, very, very close to the planned or predicted amount of time. So for example, here where I've got a zone 2 bike on Zwift in week 1, I was aiming for I'm assuming maybe 35 to 40 minutes. There you go. 40 minutes was the planned duration and I did 39 and a half minutes. So very, very close in terms of compliance. That means I'm ticking off the boxes. Yellow means there was something slightly out. So the zone 2 bike here, I think was a lot longer than what I planned. The strength session was under, and that's where these strength sessions, sometimes an hour is a bit too much initially because I just don't have enough exercises in these early day sessions. But for the most part, a lot of green. If I scroll through this first month, you can see there's quite a lot of green. There is some red in there, so I wasn't perfect through this block. But as you can see, by the end of it, and say week 2, I struggled a bit. I was a bit up and down, did some extras early and then cut some runs late because a bit of fatigue. But you can see by the end of this block, the last week, that conditioning deload week, absolutely nailed the week. I already talked about in the weekly vlog that I moved that rest day deliberately, moved it from the Saturday over to the Monday just because I was feeling a bit more fatigued early in the week. It actually worked out really, really well. And you can see highly compliant. And as we go into this current week that I'm in, this is pre-release for you guys. And I haven't talked about in the vlog yet because this is where we are today. Perfectly compliant so far this week and absolutely nailing the sessions and feeling good about the sessions too. So that was really the major focus, was get a good consistent routine and get things ticking along in the right direction. So now we can build on that, given that we've only got as of recording, we've now got sort of 9 weeks until I need to be fully fit in round 1 for AFLW in first weekend of January. So that's where it's really critical now that foundation is just set. I know I'm just going to get up, get the training done, be able to balance and manage fatigue. Even today, I did a much harder gym session straight into a 40-minute bike on Zwift, and I feel really good at the moment. I only would have finished that total but about an hour ago. Got my coffee in, and now I'm feeling great. So that's the first part I really want to sort of tick off. Introduction phases or transition phases where you're just trying to get back into a consistent routine. You don't have to be so critical about, I didn't nail the week. The big part for me was, did I get the majority of what I was trying to achieve done? And how well did I execute it? How was my fatigue going? And what are my numbers looking like so I can get into that phase? It sometimes needs a couple of weeks. For some people, it might only be 1 or 2 weeks of that. For me, it was clearly 4 weeks before I could get into that solid routine. That's okay. We're just trying to reintroduce the concept of a consistent training pattern, because it's absolutely fine to take breaks. And definitely for me at the end of this current season, I definitely needed a break and just to tune out from that consistent training routine. Keep fit, of course, but not have to stress about training. Really give my body a rest so I can reset for another long couple of seasons and year coming up into 2022. First thing from, say, a conditioning or heart rate perspective I want to look at is my zone 2, because this actually makes up probably one of the bigger portions of my training in this initial block. Obviously, I'd done a bit of running prior to getting into this block, but some of these zone 2 runs, particularly the longer one on the weekend where I'm getting up to sort of 40 odd minutes, was really, they always have been a big challenge for me. But what I wanted to highlight is, even with this sort of introductory phase, you can still gain a bit in terms of physiology, because something is always better than nothing. So I would have detrained a bit, having taken a couple of weeks, 3 to 4 weeks off as genuine off season and rest and recovery and repair. So I would have lost a little bit and detrained, but ultimately you can see if I bring up, I actually might bring up week 2, my zone 2 run, because good comparison, 6 kilometers versus 6 kilometers later down the track in week 4. Week 2, you can see here on the 16th, I did about 33 minute run. I was planning for 35, ended up cutting it a tiny bit short. You can see unhappy face in the rating perceived exertion, so wasn't feeling great, even though it was a 4 out of 10. Felt a bit sluggish, not great. Covered about 6 kilometers. And you can see here we've got an average pace of 5:26, but something I like to look at a bit more so than just averages, and this is really, really true for power on the bike in particular. But given that when I'm going out and doing these runs, where I go and run, there's a little bit of undulation across that track, and these 2 runs that I'm going to compare for you now were across that same track, similar distance, that bit of undulation, same elevation change and same direction, very similar wind conditions and that as well. So keep that in mind. What I also like to look at is this one here, this NGP, this normalized graded pace. What that does is gives you what the equivalent physiological output was if you had like basically a consistent or exactly the same effort across a session. So even though my average pace was 5:26, the actual physiological exertion was 5:09. Why is there such a discrepancy? Why am I only averaging 5:26 pace, but I'm clearly physically exerting what the equivalent of more than that is? Because of those undulations. Obviously, when I'm running uphill, I might be running at 5:30 pace, but my heart rate might still be the equivalent of 5-minute K pace. In these zone 2 sessions, it's important to understand that we need to slow down. We need to slow down, focus more on the heart rate side of things than worrying about pace too much, particularly when there's undulation. You can see in the background of this, the elevation change is basically the first half of the run is slowly, gradually getting up one of the hills. It's not a massive hill by any means, but up one of the hills. I turn around and then I come all the way back down that hill, and then there's a little bit of elevation towards the end that sort of compensates. So really, that normalized graded pace is a really good indicator. But what I want to highlight here and where my comparison is going, my average heart rate in this run here, you can see just above my head here, if I point to it just above there, 169 beats per minute was my heart rate average across this run with a max of 184. Again, for that 5:09 equivalent pace, if we're looking at evening all of this out. If I then get out of this one, let's scroll down a couple of weeks. Let's have a look at the run I did, what would have been last week, my 6K run. Here, again, very similar amount of time, 33 minutes, 28 seconds. I think there's only a couple of seconds difference between here. What I wanted to majorly highlight and where the adaptations occurred and where some good cardiovascular adaptations occurred, so increased size of the left ventricle, able to pump more blood per beat. You can see here that 5:15, so we're not too far off. Normalized graded pace is a little bit slower. but the heart rate difference is significant. Before we had 169 beats per minute average, now we have 152. Before we had a max heart rate of 184, now we got a max heart rate of 178. I'm running very much equivalent or very similar pace for a much lesser heart rate and really similar exertion overall, but much lesser heart rate, which is telling me there's some really positive aerobic adaptation coming about as a result. So that's probably one of the first things I wanted to highlight and look at from a training perspective, is having a look at, well, what is my pace doing comparative to heart rate, and really bringing the internal, which is the heart rate metric, and the external together to get a really clear picture and context around how am I actually tracking in these sessions. The other thing you'll notice with this secondary run, and this was actually a run at the end of my deload week. So you can see after a bit of training, refresh, reset, some adaptation has occurred, some recoveries occurred. I go back in and do this run when I'm feeling a lot fresher. Bang, we've instantly changed a significant amount of our physiology, of course. But you have a look, same 4 out of 10 rating of perceived exertion, but now I had the smiley face. So I felt a lot better. Even though it was the same feeling out of 10 and difficulty, I just felt a lot better at the end of the run, felt a lot more comfortable overall. So that's one of the first things I really want to highlight in terms of the zone 2 running. It's not going to be a major part of my program, of course. There's going to be a portion of it still in there, but as we start to progress, that's going to be more and more becoming of a more sports specific, or even basically a match day practice match type thing. Some really positive signs of adaptation, even though there hasn't been much sort of continuity with the intervals in particular. The big thing I wanted to get out of this was just baseline. It improved some form of aerobic ability, and that's clearly occurred in those zone 2 runs. So something I'm really happy about, and a really good starting platform to now get into that routine we were mentioning earlier. From a high intensity interval perspective, there's another great question that came through in response to the post I put up on the community page on the channel. What happened in the high intensity interval sessions? What am I looking there from a heart rate perspective? What do I need to look at? I'm going to use a couple of sessions here. I'm going to use week 3 because the first couple of weeks were kind of, when I say again, a bit all over the place. It was just getting some routine in terms of running on a Tuesday, doing some more intensity on a Tuesday, some bike on a Thursday, etc. I'm going to use this one here. Let's have a look at this session, which is a session I quite like doing. What I call 3-2-1. So 3 minute at ideally 95% of VO2 max, 2 minute, couple of 2 minute efforts at the same intensity, so 95%, and 3 1 minute efforts. You can see here I've got it all at 340 pace, which is an estimate of where I thought my 95% would be at, which I think is actually pretty close. I also manipulated the work to rest ratio, so I was leaning more and more into the aerobic side of things, which that's what you can see here. I did 3 minute on, 2 minute off, 2 minute on, 1.5 off. So all my thought process was if I have more work than rest, it's going to force me to be a little bit more aerobic. The intensity is not up at 97 or 100% or 110% of VO2 max, which is where I'm going to head in the next really 4 to 6 weeks, is where I'm going to be building up to. It's a much lower intensity comparatively if we're talking about VO2 style work, but I'm still going to get a really good stimulus. Overall, in terms of working time, what do we have? We have 3, 6, 7, 8, and 10 minutes of working time, not massive amounts. If we're looking at amount of working time you need, endurance athletes, so marathon runners, triathletes, need a lot more working time given the nature of their sport and a lot more stimulus than what a team sport athlete needs. Because again, I'm then trying to balance, well, what's happening from a strength and power perspective in the gym, down the track. So in this next coming block, I'm going to start to include things like change of direction, maximum velocity, in terms of maximal sprinting rather than just VO2 type stimulus. We're talking maximal anaerobic stimulus as well. So I don't need as much working time to get some really good adaptation still. And also, I don't want to overload it too early. I mean, 10 minutes as a good introductory phase is quite a good amount of working time. I'm going to build that. This next block I've actually got tomorrow is going to be an interval session where I'm going 6 by 2 minute on. So that's 12 minutes of work. So now I'm going to extend the volume as I go further through. But if we have a look at what happened in this session, and this is where we can probably improve this session in this next block, and where I'm going to change some things, is probably manipulate some of these variables a little bit more in my favor, and in terms of maximizing time at VO2 max. If I just have a look at heart rate, this is probably one of my favorite indicators. I highlight others, favorite indicators of what might be happening in terms of accumulating time at VO2 max in a session. So heart rate's a really good one for having in these high intensity sessions, not necessarily having a look at, well, how much time was in zone, things like that. You could look at it that way. What I more look for is to see, was I working hard enough from a VO2 perspective? Is I should definitely be seeing a cardiac drift throughout the session. And what I mean by that is interval 1 versus interval 3 versus an interval at the end. I should be able to see that heart rate just go up slightly higher. What you can see here in this first 3 minute block, my heart rate got to a peak of 187 beats per minute. Obviously, then I dropped down and did 2 minute and 1 minute. So one factor to this as to why there's not much cardiac drift across this session. You can see here by the end, I mean, I got to 188 in the 1 minute, 188. It's only sort of 1 or 2 beats different across the board. It's not really increasing. It kind of gets to the same point. Reason for that is because I've gone 3 minute down to 2 minute. So if I kept this 3 minute, I might have seen a bit more. But what I wanted to highlight here is, as I'm trying to introduce back in, yes, it was still effective. I could still get my heart rate well up into where I need it to get to, very close to 190s. I do want to see a bit more drift. And so how I'm going to manipulate some of these variables is, well, I'm going to go, like I said, tomorrow, I'm going to go and do 6 2-minute efforts. So I'm going to keep it, these 2 efforts here, I'm going to repeat that another 3 more times, these 2. So 6 total, which will bring it up to, say, 188 in the first, might bring it up to 190. You can see by the end of the second, that might get to 192 in the third, 194. Constant drift is also a great indicator of I'm spending a good amount of quality time at VO2 max like intensities, which is our ultimate stimulus for those high intensity interval sessions. So that's where I'm going to make some tweaks. I'm going to move it to a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio as well to allow me to maintain the intensity as well. Sort of found in this one, if I bring up pace as well to bring on this graph, you saw I was aiming for 340 pace, so you can see I started out at that, faded a bit in the middle, 350, and then tried to bring it home a bit. I was a little bit better in the 2-minute efforts. That's where I'm going to bring that 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, 2 minute on, 2 minute walk, to make sure I can hit 340 or slightly quicker in every single effort, because that'll also aid that cardiac drift in the sessions as well. So that's one of the key things I look at. If we now have a look at, let's look at week 4, because this was the deload week. And in terms of the session, what I did was take the same concept, I just reduced the volume. So a couple of 2-minute efforts, 2 2-minute efforts, 2 1-minute efforts, and 2 30 seconds. So what we end up with is 3 minutes, 4, 5, 6, 7 minutes. So I've dropped it by, I've basically taken out that 3-minute effort, and I've broken up the smaller efforts a little bit less. But what you notice here is because I've gone so much shorter in terms of 1 minute and 30-second efforts, my pace as a result, my prescription needs to be a lot higher to try to compensate. Still with I've got a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio here as well. So I've made a few tweaks, but I've increased the pace to compensate for less time. Whereas last time I had 3 minute, 2 minute, 1 minute efforts all at 340 pace. Now I've got 2 minute efforts at 340, 1 minute efforts at 325, and 30-second efforts at least it's sort of aiming for 310. Obviously it's hard to get an actual GPS reading when you're doing short efforts like that. But it was a good guide to start with. The mindset is I need to go faster than what I did than the 1 minute efforts. So let's have a look at what we get when we look at from a heart rate perspective, these little tweaks. If I take out everything except for heart rate, we can actually see a bit of drift. Without looking at these numbers, you can already see this is trending upwards a little bit more. So plateaus a bit towards the end, sure, but you can see by the end of the first one, 180, 186. Obviously, keep in mind this is off this is after a couple of days worth of recovery, and I'd had a rest day leading into this. So this is part of my deload week again. So heart rate might not be perfectly the same, might not be up at 188. The week prior, I was definitely feeling the effects of a bit of fatigue in that session as well. But you can see here, first interval, only 2 minutes, only got to 180, whereas a 3-minute effort in the comparative session got me to 188 or 187. So you expect that an extra minute is going to help drift this up. But interval 2, 186. All right, we're getting some clear drift. We've drifted by 6 beats per minute between intervals 1 and 2, both are 2 minutes in length. That's a really good quality drift. 184 in the 1 minute effort, again, maybe in this case, it's come down a little bit, but I could have probably gone a bit quicker. By the end, 183, again, not as much volume. And that's the one thing you probably have to keep in mind for this part of the session is we've done 1 minute and 30-second efforts rather than 2 minute and 1 minute efforts that we did in the previous session. So that'll play around at the back end, but you can see how much drift I was able to accumulate by just by going those 2 minutes, 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, allowed me to maintain the intensity a little bit better. And if we have a look at pace, I'm pretty sure you can see I started super quick by accident. But you can see here, 340, I started a bit quick and I sort of faded out, but the lowest I got was 350, whereas that 350 was occurring halfway through the interval of that first one last time. You can see here in the second 2 minute effort, 340 was my worst pace. So that meant I was actually overachieving a little bit as well. So that's where we're also going to see with that 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, better quality of effort being output. You can see here in the 1 minute efforts, I went well quicker than expected. Absolutely. I was working pretty hard. So maybe another reason for this not drifting as much in terms of heart rate, which sort of interesting, is maybe it just, one, not long enough, but two, particularly in these 30-second efforts, it's very, very anaerobic. The body doesn't really have enough time to get everything up. You actually see this heart rate lag behind a bit. And that's probably an interesting thing to talk about while I'm on it, is if I just get rid of this blue highlight, you can see heart rate lags behind the working effort. So I'm at my fastest pace and on the middle of, or the back end of the on effort, where I should, in theory, have my highest heart rate for a 30-second effort. But the peak heart rate of that interval actually happens partway through recovery. Reason being is the body plays catch up at that point. The speed's significantly up there. The pace is significantly up. Body needs time to catch up to supply the oxygen to try to meet the demand, but it can't quite. So once I finish the workload, oxygen consumption keeps coming up to compensate and pay back some of what we call the deficit early. So we have an oxygen deficit, supply doesn't equal demand. Oxygen supply does not equal the oxygen demand to create the energy of this 30-second burst. What happens afterwards is we have what we call EPOC, or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Fancy term for saying we now have more supply than demand because intensity dropped down. You can see here, drop down to zero. It's going to pay back that deficit from earlier. So that's where you see heart rate graphs tend to be offset. Don't be worried by that. It's not an error in the data. That's just how physiology responds to these types of efforts. Ultimately, we're trying to create a bit of that cardiac drift overall. And that's a really important thing to consider when we're looking at improving some of these sessions. As you saw there, introductory phase, we played around with a few variables, but clearly going forward, things like a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, manipulating that pace based on the length of the interval, and increasing the volume of session is going to aid that further cardiac drift. And we saw some positive signs of how we can achieve that. 2-minute effort seemed really effective for 340 or just sub 340 pace. 1-to-1 work to rest ratio was really effective in that as well. Hence why tomorrow I'm going out and doing 6 by 2 minute on, 2 minute off. 1-to-1 work to rest, aiming for 340 pace, slightly quicker. See how that goes as a session. We analyze, we adjust. And so that's how you can maybe take some of this info. And as I said, this introductory phase probably isn't the best example of this. I'll go a bit deeper in the next month's worth of analysis, just because you'll be able to see, all right, what does the greater volume do as well? And some of these more consistent sessions, like 6 by 2 minute on, 2 minute off, is a really perfect starting point, or a very consistent session across the board that you can see, all right, what happened in interval 1 versus interval 4 and 6. It's a lot more comparable to, say, doing like descending intervals, where it's like the last effort was shorter, so there wasn't as much time to accumulate, but you're under a bit of fatigue. A bit more complexity to that heart rate drift equation, whereas we get a lot more consistency when we do those efforts the same again and again and again. So that's a bit of an insight in terms of the running and conditioning side of things. I think that's probably the main thing I'm going to sort of focus on in these. I had a great question come through though about how did I determine the bike? So as you would have seen in the vlogs, who have seen a lot of time on the bike, it's hard for me to film going out and running. As any of you might know, if you've tried to do it before, it's very difficult. But also it can be a bit of a hindrance. Whereas on the bike, I can set up a camera, clip it to my chair or my desk. When I'm on the trainer as well, it's a lot easier. But the question I got asked was, how do I decide what my bike volume was going to be? How did I know how much cross training or conditioning I wanted to do? How did I determine the split between bike zone 2 and run zone 2? Because the bike isn't actually super sport specific. It's just an addition. It's increasing some aerobic capacity with taking the strain off the legs, which I talked about in the first 2 installments of the performance vlog that are up. Really, it's just a supplement. So I don't need to go crazy on volume. That's why I'm not going out and doing big hour, or really anything over an hour. Everything's been sort of 40, 45 minutes at most on the bike, just to keep the aerobic capacity in legs, develop some of that cardiovascular adaptation we were talking about before with the long, slow running without being on legs. Obviously, if you want to get better at running, you need to run. That's where the program's going to transition more so in the coming block. But from a bike perspective, really, I wanted to go, if I'm going to be running 3 times a week, I want to ride probably 2 to 3, just so I've got a really good aerobic focus to my entire training. And also, a bit of it for me was a little bit of just change things up, have a bit more emphasis on the bike, particularly when we're talking about bringing in those bike intervals. The VO2 style intervals, instead of doing 2 interval runs, I did one interval run, 1 interval bike. Again, to mix it up, make sure that I'm still getting some quality time at VO2. Didn't have to do anywhere near as much in terms of volume. So I was doing, like, you can have a look here, 8 minutes, went out to, that wasn't 15. I think that was actually 10 minutes that session. It ended up being not much volume again in there, and actually less volume than what I was doing running from working time perspective. But it's just a different stimulus. Again, it's giving us some adaptation, but it clearly wasn't a focus. And I put it in strategically to try and remove more running. I didn't want to go and run 4 times a week. So, all right, one of those interval sessions of running becomes a bike interval. One of those running sessions potentially becomes a zone 2 bike off legs. That's really the justification for it. Quite simple. It was just I didn't want to run all the time. So I jumped on the bike and did some other stuff. Largely, again, a bit of rationale behind that is to try and avoid things like overuse injuries too early. So too much stress through, particularly people who might get shin splints or sore knees from running, hips, lower back issues, all of that. I want to avoid that additional impact load early on in the program because the season of the year is going to be in like a 9 month process starting beginning first week of 2022. So 9-month process of in season plus the 3 months that we're working at now. It is a 12-month a year thing. I don't want to be blowing up as a result of overuse injuries 3 months from now, which would be partway through a season. I'd rather sort of time my run a little bit better and save that higher amount of impact and stress on the body for later down the track when it needs to be done. Right now, it isn't an absolute priority that I'm running X number of times a week, and particularly in this introduction phase. From a zone 2 perspective, all the zone 2, regardless of if it was my bike or my run, is always targeted around about getting to 1.5 times the longest amount of continuous work I might ever have to do in a game, which for me is, for most parts, 30 to 35 minutes. If I can do at least 1 to 1.5 times that, so 45 to 50 minutes continuously, maybe up to an hour if I really wanted to, that is going to get me through at least 1/4, if not a half of football, where obviously I'm going to have rest periods in between when there's goals and things like that. There's quarter time, there's half time. So there's a combined 25 minutes worth of recovery in those 2 breaks, forced breaks. What it means is that I've got more than enough capacity that if I had to keep running for whatever reason, there was a very, very long quarter out of the blue, I'm not going to put myself into a hole by not having the aerobic capacity in my legs. So that's where things like from a running perspective, you'll see the longest runs are 40, 45 minutes. I'm going to build up to maybe an hour. Maybe not. Again, part of that for me is still making that decision in the coming block. Do I need to go that much, or do I just want to try and keep getting a little bit quicker and a little bit better at the current distances? Again, bike is very similar. If I can keep myself continuously working, have the heart rate slightly elevated, so 140, 145-ish on the bike for me for 40 minutes, that's going to replicate, all right, if I had to just keep chipping away in a game, walk, jog, run, jog, that type of thing, I'm going to be able to handle the volume more than anything. So that's really how I make the decision. It's very, very simple. It's a bit sort of, when I say a little bit common sense in terms of, all right, my maximum working time, my worst case scenario is 30 to 35 minutes of continuous work. There's going to be some rest breaks in there, but if I can do 1.5 times that continuously with no rest break, I'm going to have more than enough aerobic capacity to get through what I need to. That's really the thought process total. So that's how I determine my running zone 2 volume, but particularly as well my bike volume. Over the coming block, that is going to reduce. So I'm actually going to cut out 1 bike a week and only do two riding sessions. So you can see this is my current week here. Did a 40-minute bike this morning, and I'm going to do 45 on the weekend. That's all I'm going to be doing. Cut out the bike intervals because the running intervals are going to come in. That's ultimately how it's going to work over the next little while. So really, probably something to maybe think about and finish on here is that another great question that was raised for this video was, what is my end goal? Compared to something like a marathon run. Like a marathon run is really simple, isn't it? It's like, well, I want to go and run a marathon. So I have a start point, finish point. I know I have to run 42.2 kilometers, and maybe I want to run it in a particular time. Maybe it's 2.5 hours, maybe it's 3 hours, maybe it's 4 hours. It doesn't really matter what that is, but it's very clear to say this is the end outcome. The difficulty with with a sport that's a little bit more sporadic and a little bit more random in nature, like football, is that I can build myself up, and that's probably a good part to lever on what I was just saying. It's like I can build myself up for my worst case scenarios, build enough capacities to handle what is the worst that could happen, because if it gets any easier than that, well, I'm easily going to be able to handle it. I can perform to a really high standard. If it does get really difficult, I know I'm going to be able to get there. We can't determine before going out onto the field or before the day what that game is going to look like. Some games are really hard and fast. Some games are a little bit easier. They might be fast, but they're shorter. So short and fast is a little bit less than maybe a little bit slower game where you're sort of doing a bit more change of direction, see, and there's so many other factors that come into it. The other thing for me as well is the decision-making load. Like going and making accurate free kick decisions on the field, I might have a day where I barely blow my whistle at all, but I'm making a lot of what we call non-decisions. So the mental load is really high because I'm seeing a lot of things, I'm processing it, I'm running, I'm physically tired, I'm starting to get mentally tired. Might not look like I'm actually doing anything, but that could be a harder day because I'm processing so much information compared to a day where it's really easy. I'm running and it's maybe a shorter game. It's a bit faster, a bit more stop-start, but it's really clean and I don't really have to make many decisions. The decisions stand out to me. And so preparing for like I said, preparing for your worst case scenarios that is the ultimate sort of goal for me. What are the things that could go wrong and make me become under the pump, so to speak? How can I build the capacities and the robustness to handle that and be able to handle that, recover, and potentially have to do it again in a short turnaround? So that's where all of my training comes into it. That's where I've got the high intensity interval running from a VO2 perspective, plus also starting to add in some change of direction work and also the max velocity to handle, all right, if the game's going to be really short and sharp, I've got the maximum speed to go with it. If it's going to be a bit more sort of move around, pinball around, I've got the change of direction to do that. If it's going to be a little bit more of a longer sustained game, well, all right, it might be going end to end, just up and back, and I've got a 3 or 4 minute period where I just have to be on. It's a VO2-like effort, and I just have to be smart about how I manage that. So all of those bases are covered by doing that, and then that's where strength comes in as well. It's like strength is just building me the tissue capacities to be able to handle it, making sure I've got strong Achilles and calves, making sure my hamstrings are robust enough to handle the high speed running, making sure my quads are strong enough to produce force so I can get off the mark really quickly and explode and sprint away or change direction quickly. All of this is how it's sort of tied in. So really my end goal is prepare for chaos and random and prepare for your worst case scenario. That's ultimately going to lead me to hopefully be able to execute when it's a best case scenario to a really high standard, but when it is that worst case, I'm still going to be able to execute. So it's planning, it's working out a way that we can develop a program that's going to build me up for any scenario that's going to be thrown at me. So hopefully you got a bit out of just me going through and running through all of my thought processes and ideas around training, analyzing that first block. I know there's probably, there was a few things in there that I'm going through a couple of scenarios and going, it might have been this, might have been that. And the reason for that is because it was just an introductory block. This next block, I'm expecting and anticipating to be a hell of a lot easier for me to analyze, but also for you to understand, given it is a bit more of that traditional routine training structure that you might be more familiar with. And it's also going to show up and reflect in the data as well, that side of things as well. Like I said, with things like heart rate drift in HIIT sessions, it's much easier to follow when the session is being executed in a little bit more of a typical way rather than sort of that just introduction. Better opportunity for me to go a little bit deeper into the strength side of things, what my volume's like, what my sets and rep schemes like, the selection of exercises. I think that's probably a more appropriate time given that I now have a really solid routine and I'm actually going to cover that in the upcoming week's installment of the performance vlog that everyone's going to have access to, but I'm going to go through in a bit more of a broad way. I'm going to save all the good stuff for you guys because again, I want to reward you for supporting the channel, being part of Team NJ Sports Science. Can't thank you enough for joining up here to support and help you learn as best you can, and hopefully some of this content is helping with that and keep you motivated on your path as well. So hopefully you enjoyed this first one. Let me know what your thoughts were. Always happy to adjust and change this up as we go, sort of working through this for the first time. Put me under the pump a little bit to get all of this done. I know it's going to be a bit longer video, but also working out a process in this initial stage was a little bit tricky. So hopefully next month it's going to be a little bit smoother and get this out to you a little bit sooner and right at the beginning of the week. My aim is going to be on Mondays to get this out rather than sort of middle of the week where we are here. It just didn't quite happen because again, we're just trying to work through the process and learn as we go in this format. Thanks again for watching this one. Hopefully you got plenty out of this first month's analysis. Thanks for supporting the channel and we'll see you in the next one.